Today, you're going to begin your journey as a UI designer here in 2019. Oh, and hey, I'd like to mention this video's sponsor, Skillshare.com. Now, it's a brand new year here in 2019, and Skillshare will help keep you learning and thriving as they offer 25,000 different classes in coding, design, business, and more. For instance, you're about to watch my UI design course, but you could learn about UX design afterwards here at Skillshare. Skillshare is also super affordable with a subscription that only costs $10 a month, but if you're one of the first 500 of my subscribers to click the link below here in the description, you get the first 2 months free, so take advantage. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro here. So today I'm releasing this 100% free UI design course it's geared towards beginners. Now in the past, in this channel, I've done different tutorials, bite-sized tutorials on designing websites and apps and such, which are user interfaces, but I've never really put out a full course where I really explained every minute detail. So the initial part of this course, you're gonna see me in front of some slides, kind of talking about the very important design fundamentals that you need to understand if you're going to be a good UI designer. And then we're going to step into Adobe Experience Design, which is free, and there's a version of it that's free that you can use and follow along, although you don't have to. You can use anything else like Figma or Sketch or Photoshop or whatever. And we're going to design a fictional UI, all right? And so the goal here is for you to walk away at the end of this having a lot more confidence than you have now. And right at the end of the course, I mean, you're not going to be a pro if you're a beginner, but you're going to minimize that time that it takes from going from creating designs that just look like crap, honestly, to more intermediate level stuff, and then eventually to pro level stuff. All right, so make sure you subscribe here if you haven't yet. Click the notification bell icon as well. I'm always putting out tutorials and courses. And so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. This next part is just going to be a series of slides, and then we'll jump into actually applying what we learned here during this conceptual part of the course. So first, we're going to tackle what is UI design. So of course, if you're an absolute beginner, UI is an acronym for user interface design. All right, so for our purposes, we're going to say it's a digital medium that a user interacts with. You know, it's a very simple definition, although it doesn't, in the broader scope of what it means to be a UI designer, it doesn't just have to be digital. It could be something, for instance, like a keyboard that you're touching. It could even be based on sound. But for us, we're just going to say it's a digital medium, usually a screen in the form of like a monitor or a tablet or a phone of some sort. And your role as a UI designer is to prepare all the visual elements that make up that user interface that the person is using. So a website is a user interface that they can go just to gain information or to interact with. Also an app. And so these are all things that, you as a UI designer would be preparing. Very simple conceptual level stuff here. So what is UI versus UX design? I wanted to throw this in simply because there's a lot of confusion sometimes when it comes to these two terms. And really, we didn't have these separations early on, back like in the early 2000s or late 90s. But as, of course, the industry has matured, we started to separate these different concerns. So if you're a UI designer, you're not a UX designer, and vice versa, unless you understand both fields. They're two separate things. So a UI is a visual, usually in the form of screens, pages, visual elements, and such. And UX or user experience design is focused on the user's experience while they're interacting with your product or service. All right, so you as a UI designer, you're dealing with the visual aspects that a person is using on a product or service, and the UX is completely not based on just visuals. It really has to do with that user's experience, thus UX design. I thought I would throw in also some quotes from industry professionals who really put it in their own words in terms of what the difference between UI and UX is. So UX is focused on the user's journey to solve a problem, and UI is focused on how a product surfaces look and function. And that's from Ken Norton. UI is the bridge that gets us where we want to go, and UX is the feeling we get when we arrive. And that's from Jason Ogle. And one last one, a UX designer is concerned with the conceptual aspects of the design process and leaving the UI designer to focus on the more tangible elements, and that's from Andy Budd. All right, so hopefully you now have a pretty decent understanding of what the difference is between UI versus UX design. I also wanted to throw one more comparison in here. Example, UI design versus front-end developer. All right, so this is something I sort of covered in my video a few days ago about front-end development in 2019. But they are two separate things, but sometimes there's overlap. Just as there's overlap with being a UI versus UX designer. If you're a freelancer and you're building an app for somebody, then or a website, then you're assuming all of these roles, assuming you don't, of course, outsource any of this work individually. But for large businesses who have a lot of resources and money to hire out people, they would possibly have a UI designer, a front-end developer, and a user experience designer as well. So the key difference between a UI designer versus a front-end developer, a UI designer handles designing and prototyping the screens, while a front-end developer takes those design and uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to make them work on a device. Now, when I say make them work, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be fully functioning. Because if it has, for instance, a backend where you have databases, you would need a backend developer to actually make that function. But as it pertains to the part that a user interacts with and sees in the front end, like in the browser, that's the difference between a UI designer and a front end developer. The front end developer tapes those mock-ups or prototypes that the UI designer creates, and then uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to make them all work. Sometimes you don't even need JavaScript, depending on the project. All right. Before we begin with the actual design fundamentals, I wanted to talk about designing and prototyping UIs and the software that you can use. All right. There's a bunch of them. Back in the day, it used to be Photoshop for a long time. Then Sketch came out, and that's exclusively just for Mac. A couple years later, Adobe Experience Design came out. Now, even though it says Experience Design, that doesn't mean it's just for user experience. This is a design tool and prototyping tool that kind of takes care of both of those elements. There's also a free version available. It's what I use, and that's what I'm going to be using in this course. Although you don't necessarily have to use it. You could be using Figma, for instance, which is another very popular tool that's web-based for UI design and prototyping, I believe. There's also Envision, there's Gravit, there's which icon is that? Oh yeah, Framer. There's a lot of others that you can research out there. All right, so design fundamentals. This is really what you need to understand first before you really get yourself involved in UI design. And we're going to go over it very quickly. It's not something you have to spend weeks or months studying or whatever. Just for you to really get your feet wet if you're new or your first time to this, you need to understand at a very basic level design fundamentals. And these type of fundamentals don't apply just to UI design. They really apply to any type of visual design in a sense. And so we're going to go over these individually one by one here in a second. But first, these 6 different principles, and there could be more, but these are the most important, especially in relation to UI design, are color and contrast, white space, visual hierarchy, complexity versus simplicity, consistency, and scale. All right. Also, you could probably throw in having an understanding of typography is also important as well, which we'll touch on here in a second. So let's start with the first one. And by the way, these are in no particular order. You don't have to understand one more than the other. You have to have a solid understanding from all of them, in my opinion, to really make a UI design come together and look professional. So the way I'm going to do this, we're not going to have any more text, all right, because text gets boring after a while. I'm going to do this based on examples. So we're talking about color and contrast. Having an understanding of color and contrast when you're designing UIs is so freaking important. It's one of the most important elements out there. Let's take a look at this thing right here. And I'm sorry if you get blinded by how ugly it is. But right here, we have just kind of like what's called an email capture. And you may see something like this on a website or an app or something to try to get people to enter their emails just for lead generation, as it's called. the color and contrast here is wrong. Both are wrong. Color and contrast is wrong. If we look at the, starting at the top, enter to win today, go on a trip of a lifetime with your family. This actually contrasts pretty well with the chosen background. You could probably also use white and it would still contrast well because this is kind of like a mid-level in terms of lightness, this color right here. But when we get from this section right here where it's kind of brown to this pink, there's not enough contrast between these different hues, and they just kind of hurt your eyes. Going forward, your email address, you can barely see this placeholder text, and you want people to be able to see your type-based content, especially the real important call to action type stuff where you want people to take action to enter their email or click a button. If you look over here, enter today, this is also called a call to action. It's a button. You can clearly see enter today. So in this example, the button itself, it does it well in terms of contrast and color that really sticks out. But we can make a massive improvement by just changing one color in this example right here. All right, so this already looks a lot better than it did before. We just changed this color from that pink color to white. And now it contrasts with this top section a lot more. Let's see if we can make additional improvements with this. All right, so now we kind of took that red or pinkish sort of color, and it really kind of competed too much with the eye in terms of color for this call to action button. So we're simply just making it gray, very light gray, and then making it so that we could definitely see it with like a 5-pixel stroke or a border at the end. And we also increased the contrast so you can actually see your email address. And also we can further improve it. I think enter to win today in terms of being white and this text sticks out a lot better. And we can also make other adjustments. So there's a lot of it that's subjective. You have a lot of options that can work. For instance, if we wanted to use black text, we could just make a very light gray right here. And you could still see a separation of these two containing elements. And you don't necessarily even need to have a color up here. So there's a lot of options. You could also turn this into a night theme if you understand contrast and color well, like this. So if we're looking at the background here, we could see it's an element that still works with this background. It's the same hue, but we're just lightening things up. We made all the text either light or white so that it contrasts well. This color here works well with these other colors and really sticks out as a call to action should. So understanding color and contrast is something that we'll talk a lot about when we're actually designing a UI going a little bit later in the course. Let's also talk about white space. All right, so what is white space? All right, well, let's take a look at this example. Everything that's wrong with this element right here, right now, is a problem with what's called white space. And so white space is basically the negative space, as it's referred to as, or the empty space around your different UI elements. So up here, when it comes to the type-based elements, if we look at the top of enter, or this whole element right here to the top of the container, we have this amount of white space, but then look to the left, there's only like half of it. Same thing with the bottom. And it throws off the flow of the design so much when you don't get white space right. And this is something I see new designers, UI designers, doing all the time. They're just inconsistent in their approach towards applying white space. We could also see this is kind of thrust over here, but then the buttons all the way over here. This is maybe centered. It just doesn't flow well. Also, even inside of here, this container, we have an equal amount of white space on the top and bottom, but on the left, it's just pushed way over. You want to try to make things consistent and mathematical in terms of your application of white space as much as possible. So if we go back to the original example, you see just how much better the correct usage or an application of white space really is to the overall aesthetic and the composition of a UI design. Let's also talk about visual hierarchy. Sounds scary, but really it's not. Again, we'll use our example. Everything wrong about this one this time is a problem with visual hierarchy. In terms of color and contrast, it works well. In terms of scale in white space, we also have, in terms of white space, it's working pretty well. But your eye doesn't really know where you should be looking first. For instance, if we go down on our call to action button, it's using the same color as up here, so it doesn't really stick out too much. It doesn't grab our eye. The enter to win today has the same exact type properties as it does here on the sub headline right here. So this is where visual hierarchy is so important. You use a lot of the UI design fundamentals in terms of understanding, your usage of color, scale, and position and white space. And you use all of these things to reinforce a visual hierarchy, as it's called. So the most important element here, enter to win today, which is the headline that we want to grab their attention, that should be much larger. And we use stuff like font weight, making it bold, stuff like scale, stuff like color, to make things really stand out and put things into their proper order in terms of a hierarchy. So if we go back to the original example, you'll see that it becomes much better and easier to understand when you utilize that proper visual hierarchy, making this larger, making this button stand out from the rest of the colors, and all of that good stuff. Now, what about complexity versus simplicity? Let's go ahead and take a look at another example. Now, I can't tell you how many times when I do my live design reviews on Friday here on Fridays on YouTube, how new designers, they're excited, they have a lot of tools at their disposal, but unfortunately, more is not better. So you're trying to, when you get into this realm where you're adding outer glows, you're adding strokes, you're adding embosses, you're adding gradients all over everything, it really takes away from the overall composition. So going back, you want to, especially if you're a new designer, stay away from all that stuff. You can use it, but you have to know how to use it properly. And so this works much better right here. Just by removing all of that junk. So stay away from that, most importantly. All right, so now let's talk about consistency. All right, so let's look at our example here. Here we can see something's off. All right, so first let's talk about the type. We have Times New Roman or a sans serif or a serif font, as it's called, mixed in with a sans serif font right here. Now, you can actually mix serif with sans serif fonts, but you have to know how to do it correctly. So I always advise, if you're just starting out, stick with one or the other. We can also see down here in the Enter Today button text, it's Comic Sans. So we're mixing three different typefaces with each other on the same UI, and it's pretty much always a no-go. And we can also see, for instance, there's also an inconsistent application of white space here with this your email being pushed over here to the left, where everything else is on this sort of same column right here. So, in terms of how you're applying, these different visual properties, you want to be consistent as possible. There we can see everything is now consistent as it is, and it's just much better looking. And then finally, and last but not least, we have scale. All right, so when it comes to type-based elements, I see a lot of people getting the scale wrong. They'll either make things too large or too small, and we sort of have both of that happening right here. The Your Email Address placeholder, way too small. It's too hard to read. And then we have Enter Today, which is quite large. I wouldn't say it's too large, but really in terms of the rest of the type, it's thrown off. So there's not a really consistent, again, a lot of these design principles will overlap and some will take from the other. It's not a consistent approach to scale as it applies to this design. So once we fix all this stuff, it becomes much better. All right, so now, hopefully you have at least a basic level understanding of these different design fundamentals and how they all should work together. And what we're going to do now is we're going to step into Adobe Experience Design. Again, if you're using a different application, you can still do that. I'm not doing anything crazy that requires specific tools in your UI design software. And we're going to apply all of these design principles. And hopefully at the end, you're going to walk away feeling quite confident. If you're new to UI design, maybe this is the first time you've done it, or it's the first month that you've been subjected to it, even after watching this course, you're not going to become the best designer ever in the world. You're not going to be creating designs that, a lot of the top people on like Behance and Dribbble or whatever are producing, because that simply just requires practice. It requires practice, but you can really negate the length of time, or you can reduce the length of time that it takes from going from producing beginner level work to intermediate to advanced if you understand these design fundamentals. All right, so hopefully you follow along, and let's get to it. All right, so we're going to get started here in Adobe Experience Design. I'm going to, again, assume that you haven't really touched it before. So when you open it up, we have certain presets that we can use right here. You can also choose your recently opened documents. We're just going to choose Web 1920 right here. And we're going to assume that this is just not really an app. It's a website for some fictional service. All right, so just real quickly, just to zoom in and out as I just did, you hold the Alt key in your mouse scroll wheel. You can pan by holding the space bar and left clicking, dragging around, and all that good stuff. That's pretty much all I'm going to go over in terms of how to move around. That's mainly what you're going to need to know. Of course, if you just use the scroll wheel, you can scroll up and down with the different artboards. All right, so for this one, if we double click here, we can change the name. We'll just make it home. And so the very first thing I usually start with, which makes most sense because it's at the top of a website or an app or whatever, is where are we going to place a logo in the navigation bar. All right, so sometimes people try to get real creative with this, especially new designers who are trying to be extra creative, and they'll put the logo to the right somewhere, or maybe they'll place the primary navigation at the bottom of the screen. Try not to do that. I mean, there's certain times when you can break out of the typical patterns, but more often than not, you're gonna want to do what your users are most accustomed to doing, and it makes the user experience so much better when they don't have to go search for things, and it might be a little bit confusing. So for us, we're just going to make a fictional logo for a fictional business that doesn't exist. All right, so usually, as a UI designer, that is completely separate from being an identity designer, which is somebody who handles actually creating the logo and the color, the website color themes, and the colors that are associated with a business, essentially. So sometimes you will be provided with that. Of course, if you're a freelancer, there's going to be overlap here, and you may be expected to do both, which, it's tough because you're all separate crafts. But for us, we're just going to take the type tool, left click here, and I'm just going to come up with a fictional company name. I don't know why. I've been seeing those 23andMe commercials all the time. 26 and 4. That's the name of our fictional business. So if I zoom up here, Alt and scroll wheel, we can get a better look. And over here we have the properties, which this all changes based on what you currently have selected. So if you select the canvas, for instance, we can change the background color and all that good stuff. We're going to leave ours white. And so if we select back onto that text layer, all of the fonts that you have installed on your machine will show up here. So I think I'll just use Tahoma bold. Pretty much actually, I don't know if I like that. You know what? Yeah, that's fine. We'll leave it like that. I'm not going to be too picky about the fictional logo. So I'm going to make it black as well. And by the way, if you couldn't see that, it's showing up right behind me. Yeah, it's just the fill little button right there. Very easy to change colors, obviously. And another thing I want to mention, if we're talking about UI design and web design specifically, when you click on the canvas, you can see we have this grid option right there. If I toggle that on and off, we can see we have this grid with options down here with like a 12 columns, and also as well as the grid color that's showing up behind me again. And really, what that's for is when you're dealing with web design and layout design, and this is also applicable to some apps, you design based on a grid system. And these are 12, this is the most common is a 12 column grid. And when you're designing a mockup like we are, and we're not yet in HTML and CSS, it's always a good idea to have an idea of your grids and how these are going to be structured, especially if you pass this on to a front-end developer who's able to open this up in your software, your UI software, and they could see, okay, so we should structure this HTML element with a certain amount of columns and so on. So you'll see how this works going forward. So periodically, I will toggle this on and off, the columns, just to get an idea of where things should start and end. All right, and so that brings up yet another topic. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, are we going to have 100% fluid layout where, if a person is on a large desktop, for instance, and they have their browser maximized, will the left portion of the UI, like the logo, for instance, will go all the way to the very outer edge of the browser, or is it going to be maybe a fixed centered sort of layout, kind of like how we have here? More often than not, unless you have an extremely content-heavy site where you have a ton of content, having a fixed area in the center is probably the best bet. If you have a site with not much content, it's usually not a good idea to space everything out real far, because it makes it difficult for the user to go back and forth, like looking at the certain elements that they need to access. All right, so I will bring that back real quick, the grid. All right, what I want to do here is I'm going to add like some sort of fictional like letter mark or symbol rather for the logo. So I'm just going to drag out a rectangle, and these little corner radiuses right here, I'm going to drag in just so you can see that they are just rounded completely on the side. We're going to give it a fill, and I'm just going to give just some random color possibly. That's a pretty good blue. By the way, I do want to toggle that off because it's kind of getting in the way at this point. So we have this blue, and then we will also duplicate that with Control D. And then we'll make this some sort of color that kind of goes well with it. Maybe right there. So we can just add this to our swatches. And this as well. And by the way, in Adobe XD, we also have an Assets panel, which you can access by clicking that part right there. And you can see we have colors and all this good stuff. So for instance, if we select this, we can choose colors. So we've just added a color to our assets. And so if we go to change this color, then any other element with that color will automatically be updated. So you don't have to individually select elements and change them. So that's a good idea to do as well. All right. So let's go ahead and toggle that off. Then just to make it a little bit more interesting, maybe I'll go, I'll hold Shift and then rotate it and then scale it down. Maybe something like that. It's not the world's greatest logo, but I think it'll work. Maybe make it a little bit larger like this. Yeah, something like that. And so the size, you can experiment. The size isn't entirely important at this point. Let me try my favorite font. Yeah, I like that better. Montserrat. People were probably wondering why I didn't choose that. The regulars on this channel, I'm always using that font. All right, so this is the logo that we're using. Let's bring back our grid. Okay, that's good. And now let's worry about a navigation. Traditionally, when it comes to the most common pattern for aligning and setting forth a navigation for just your average landing page like this, a page that somebody lands on essentially, is just to have a horizontal navigation, usually situated somewhere in the middle to upper right, usually right aligned. Whether that's, if it's a fluid, it's going to be all the way to the right of the browser, or to the very end of the 12th column of the grid right over here. So what I'll do is just take this type and duplicate it, Control D, and we will go ahead and I'm just going to put in some fictional links right here, or paste to subpages. So we have home here. I'll duplicate this, and I'm just kind of holding Shift and right-clicking and dragging it over. Holding Shift will make it so that you can't go down. It'll stay on the same horizontal axis. I'm going to type in services here. We'll duplicate that. And by the way, when you move things around, you see this little guide show up, like 84 pixels between those. I think maybe the grid's kind of interfering with that process, but usually to get them aligned up, we'll worry about that after, once we set this all up with the right type. Well, this one will just be like an about page, and then we'll do one more. Contact. All right, so we're not going to use this type yet. We're not going to focus on that just yet, but I just want to get it placed right here. There we go. We can see it. There we go. They're all an even amount away from each other. So now we have some questions to ask ourselves. Right now, remember we did talk about what visual hierarchy is, and we could see that we have the logo that has this type, and then we have the home, services, about, and contact, which has the same exact type applied to it. We didn't change this at all. Really, we want the logo to stand on its own, and we also want to separate it visually in some way from the navigation so that they don't look like they're the same type of elements. And this is one of the core functions that you have as a UI designer, is to understand what visual hierarchy is. So like we mentioned before, when we went over visual hierarchy, we have different ways and manners from which we can change and reinforce visual hierarchy through different properties. So in the case of type, one of the things that we have at our disposal is size or scale. We can make these smaller. We could change the color or contrast. So, I mean, we could change the contrast perhaps to a mid-gray. Now, all of a sudden, the logo automatically stands on its own. We've created separation just through contrast. We could change it to a color. All right, so that separates it. And I would say that's not too bad. That actually works. So a lot of this is subjective as long as you get these design fundamentals correct. We could also change the font weight. And this is one of the most common ways and the ways that I like handling it and changing and reinforcing the visual hierarchy. So if we change this from bold to regular or medium, we could see that completely separates it visually from this logo right here. And I like it a lot. I think we're going to stick with that. So now, oh, and by the way, you're not just limited to changing one of those properties. You know, you could also bring down the opacity or you know, obviously change the contrast a little bit, which would work as well. But I'm just going to leave it like this as is. So let's check our grid. And what we would normally do, either the front-end developer would do, is probably just right align it to the very edge of this grid right here. All right. So another thing that we have to concern ourselves with is, should this be contained in some sort of container like this? And really, that's kind of a subjective preference as a UI designer. It depends on what you have down here. Maybe you have some type of big photograph-based hero image, as they're called, or maybe you don't. But what matters ultimately, if you do decide to have some sort of container up here, is that you implement it correctly with those design fundamentals in mind. I'm personally not going to add one with this, but I will real quickly integrate one just to show you if you wanted to have some sort of navbar strip, that you do it correctly. All right, so this here is completely fine as long as you're not, for instance, having like a massive sort of photographs hero section right here, which could cause issues with contrast and readability, which would be a big no-no. I see a lot of people do that, unfortunately. But let's say, for instance, we're just going to copy this. We'll duplicate it, Control-D. If we have a navbar section with a big strip going back here, let's go to our layers down here. We can just sort this all the way to the bottom. All right. We want to make sure that this is implemented correctly if we do decide to have some sort of colored bar up here. So let me go ahead and we'll make the fill. Maybe we'll make the fill this color. It could be either or, really. So when I change this, what are some things that might be wrong about this? Or you pause it if you have to, but there are several things wrong about the way that I implemented this bar going behind the logo in the navigation. All right, so let's go through this checklist that we went over in terms of UI design fundamentals. First, we can ask, and these are in no particular order. First, the thing that's that's sticking out right away to me as being incorrect is there is an uneven amount of white space vertically. All right, so I'm talking about from the top of this element, this 26 and 4, the word mark of the logo, and all the way to here, we have a certain amount. Here I can illustrate it with the rectangle tool. We have that amount, but then beneath it, we have only half that amount. It does not look correct, and it throws off the flow of the design. And if you're not aware of these subtle issues, then that's the difference. That's the whole difference between being a good UI designer and somebody who's new, who just doesn't understand and doesn't have the eye yet and the intelligence to see yet, or the experience, that there's something completely off. So if we wanted this to be matched up, well, we have to make sure that we bring this thing down to even white space on all sides. All right, so that looks a lot better than what we had going before. Now, it might be a little bit too much padding on the top and bottom, just because if the size of our user interface is only this big, we'll say that this is above the fold when the user doesn't have to scroll anymore in the browser, then this is a pretty thick looking nav bar. Ideally, maybe right around here would be better. And then I would just take these elements inside. I'm going to hold Shift and left click to deselect the background, and then just get them centered up right around the center mark, which is right around there. So that looks pretty solid in my opinion. Next up, the next consideration would be for this logo. Obviously, these clash big time. So this wouldn't be a good color if you're using the same color that's already a part of the logo, because you're missing elements of it. So you can make this white and this another color, but if you can't change the colors of the logo, of course, then you can only change the background element itself. So in this case, you want to make sure things contrast enough. So if you did have certain colors that you didn't want to, clash with or hide if they're the same, then you could just make these very light gray or very light colors like this. So everything contrasts still well. And back when it was this color, I might experiment with adding or changing these and making these white and possibly bold as well, so that they really contrast with this blue, which is kind of like a mid-range contrast area. It's not an absolute black or a white. All right. So like I mentioned though before, we're not going to be adding a bar like this. So I'm just going to delete that. We'll make these black again. And then, yeah, we're all good to go. I'm also going to move this down just a bit. Okay, so we're already quite far into this, and we only got a couple elements on here, but that's because I want to spend a ton of time making sure that everybody understands, my exact every detail thought process about, why I make certain decisions. So let's continue on. Now we have what's commonly referred to as, in a typical landing page, a hero section right here. And you obviously have a million different routes that you could take this, a different amount of columns. It all depends on really what the objective of this page is. Every page should have a goal of some sort, especially if we're talking about marketing landing pages and such, which is kind of the fictional case that I'm using here. A lot of things that I'm seeing in terms of trends from 2018 into 2019 are having nice illustrations, heavy illustrations, vibrant illustrations somewhere in this section. Also, as always, you should always address what the purpose of the page is, so that people aren't confused. They want to know instantly, or usually they just leave. We've known that for a long time through different studies and such. And also usually outside of some sort of headline that really sticks out well with good type and good design fundamentals, maybe a call to action of some sort. Don't just leave people hanging. Give them a button, give them maybe a scroll indicator. Again, it all depends on the case, of whatever this particular project is. So for us, I'm just going to have a very simple illustration. And I'm gonna design it here in Adobe XD, and just to show you that it's pretty capable. It's a pretty capable design tool. Now, when it comes to this illustration, this technically is not part of a UI design. It's a graphic design, essentially. So that's why there are just graphic designers who specialize in that stuff, and then there's UI designers, front-end developers, yada, yada, yada. But again, because most people aren't in jobs that are just confined to one strict area, unless you're working for a massive company who has a ton of employees, then you're going to want to know how to work with the pen tool and the shape tools as well, and how to actually, as well as outside of just understanding the tools, when it comes to graphic design, also creating effective graphic designs and illustrations to get your point across. So we're going to assume that 26and4 is a web hosting company of some sort, and so we're going to reinforce that with some sort of very simple abstract design, kind of just centered right here. And again, you could position in any different way, as long as you do it, again, with these UI design fundamentals in mind. So I'm going to create kind of like a an isometric, I'm gonna say like a quasi isometric perspective icon right here, because I'm technically, you would probably want to use Adobe Illustrator for this because there's more tools to achieve it and make it easier. But I'm going to do this rather quickly as possible in here, just to save time, and so we're not jumping back and forth between different apps. So I'm going to take the rectangle tool, and I'm going to create a square. I'm going to hold Shift and Alt, or just Shift itself. It just changes how and where it draws the tool, or the box rather. And we're going to give it no border, and we'll just make it this initially our blue color. All right, I'm going to rotate this holding Shift so that it's more of like a diamond sort of shape. And then I'm going to double click into it, and in Adobe XD that gives you access to the individual anchor points that you can move around. All right, so I'm just gonna, unfortunately, at the time of recording this, they don't have the ability to skew or perspective distort things, so I'm just gonna do it by eye. I'm holding Shift and bringing this down. Holding Shift and bringing that down as well. I'm just trying to eyeball it. I could get another rectangle here to make sure that these are all even from there, but I'm not gonna worry about that too much. Okay, right around there is fine. Now I'm going to duplicate it, Control D, and then just put the other one right there. And I'm creating kind of like just a very abstract computer at this point. So I'm going to take the pen tool, hold Shift, left click, then hold Shift, come down here, and there we go. So now I've created another box, or a side of the box, and we're going to give it this color, except I'm going to come and make it perhaps maybe a little bit lighter. Actually, no, I think we'll leave that side, the light side, the same color. And if you need to make adjustments, you can just double click, make sure you get that anchor point right there. You could hold Shift to make sure it stays on the vertical plane there. We're going to duplicate this, Control D, and then I'm just going to left click and drag all the way to the other side. And this one, I'm going to assume the light source is coming from this direction, so I'm going to make it darker. I would say, maybe somewhere right around there. And maybe this side will make a little bit lighter. So there we go. We've made a cube that looks pretty accurate in terms of being isometric. We can also delete this bottom one because we can't see it at all. And we just put that one back. Look at that. So just by utilizing the same colors consistently in your UI, which is, another UI design fundamental, we can see it's already coming together quite well, and it looks solid. Even though we just have really just 3 different objects. We have this blue here, it's being used here in different shades, and it just looks nice. This in and of itself doesn't really make sense, so I'm gonna add just a couple buttons on the side of it. And a quick way I found to do this is just to duplicate this right here, this selection, and then hold Shift and Alt in, and real quickly we'll just make this like I don't know, almost a white color, or you could go white, doesn't matter. And then we'll scale this down, hold Shift, and so that helps it maintain the exact angle from the rest. And we could just pretend that this is like a server rack or something. So we could take the repeat grid tool with that selected and just pull down. And then in between them, we can drag them close together. And we'll just bring it all the way down. Yeah, something like that. And I'm looking to make sure that there's an even amount of white space from the left, bottom, and top. And it looks pretty solid to me. So then we could take this and duplicate it. Maybe put one right there. And then I'm going to ungroup this grid and just get rid of all the rest of these. And this one, I'm just going to change up a little bit and maybe make it a little bit longer. Maybe right around there. Again, try to keep it in line with this lineup right here. And then we'll just go ahead and take the repeat grid once again. Oops. And try to get these to line up as much as possible. We'll go ahead and ungroup it. And delete the bottom two. Now, if it kind of got off a little bit, you can just hold shift and drag these down as needed. Now they look pretty close together. And we can also change up the color so that it makes it a little bit more unique and diverse. So with those selected, we'll just choose, we'll choose this color alone, and then maybe we'll change the hue. And you can change the darkness as well. So you have a lot of options as long as your elements are contrasting enough. You don't want areas that just barely contrast because it makes it look like absolute garbage. I think I might change a couple things here. See right here to here, this doesn't quite contrast as much as I would like it. So maybe something right around there. I'm going to take all these elements except for this. So this, what we just created, and scale them down. Although first we have to select ungroup grid. There we go. So we're giving them even more room to breathe in terms of white space. All right, and of course you would want to keep on doing this until, of course, you have something that's solid and it communicates the idea properly. So what I'm going to do, you've seen me use these tools enough, and I'm just going to use the same processes to add more to this, and I'm going to speed up the video. Also, I kind of want to simulate the idea that data is flowing through here in some way. So I'm going to take the ellipse tool and hold Alt. And kind of create an oval. And then create a dark area out of this. So we're going to get rid of the stroke. Let's get that color right there with the eyedropper tool. And we're going to rotate this just slightly. All right, something, right around there I think would work. To make sure it's kind of centered here. All right, and then what I'll do, just to create, let's see, we'll do kind of like a dashed line coming out of here. So just starting right here, we'll create a line, hit escape. We're going to take the size and increase it a bit. We're going to change the corners to a round cap, and then also we're going to increase a dash with a gap that's kind of bigger, and the size or the dash will be maybe, I would say right around here. We'll take the size down maybe to 3 or 4. And then we want to choose a color also that kind of works well. Maybe this. Yeah, that works pretty well. And you may want to experiment with the gap and the size and all of that. I think that's pretty good right there. And we can just duplicate that. And we'll take this layer here. We'll right click and choose Arrange and Send to Back. So that puts it at the very end. So it makes it look like that there's the data is going through this, as in like website traffic or something. And so now we're getting pretty good. We have an interesting look. Maybe what we can do is take everything with exception to the line right here and that line, and we'll group it up. And we'll rename this to PC1. We're going to duplicate it, the whole thing. And then we'll take the one at the bottom. We're just going to move it off to this a little bit. And then we will scale things down maybe. Yeah, maybe we'll put one like right over here. Something like that. And there, as you can see, you can keep going and going if you wish. You don't want to make it too elaborate. But I think this for now is fine. One last thing I want to do just to add the illusion of depth to it is to add a shadow coming off. So I'll take the pen tool, hold shift, and I'll come out maybe right around here. Wow, I did that almost perfectly. I got it lined up right there, but I was just holding shift the whole time. And then what we'll do is I will put this at the absolute bottom for now, get rid of the border and give it a fill. And we'll give a linear gradient right here. And we can go ahead and adjust the angle of the gradient. So we're starting maybe way out here. And then just very subtle, hold shift, and there we go. When it comes to the shadow, you don't really want it to stick out too much because you don't want it to contrast a lot. I mean, because you want a lot of contrast so that your primary element sticks out real well. All right, so that's good. I'm going to group that all up, and then we'll just call this server. Okay, so we're doing pretty good right here now. Now we have to ask ourselves, where do we want to put this? Do we want to maybe make it larger and stick it over here to the right, which we definitely could, and then maybe have some text right here and a call to action or something? Or do we want to center it? Either way, it's fine. Again, as long as you implement it with good UI design fundamentals in mind. So putting it up here would be a bad idea because it's way too close to the navigation, especially on this larger viewport resolution of 1920 by 1080, which is the canvas size. So we want to put it at least probably no taller than right there, and I'm probably going to scale it down maybe to right around that size. Okay. Now this shadow right here is kind of throwing me off because it's hard to see exactly having it centered. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take this path and take it out of that group. And then right here, we can align this horizontally. There it was. It was almost perfect already, but that will make sure it's aligned. Now we can put this back into the server group right there. Awesome. So again, alignment is one of those important things when there's just an element standing on its own, whether it's text or an icon of some sort, you want it to be aligned in the center. All right, so everything is looking pretty solid now. So now let's think about addressing what this site is about. This icon alone isn't enough, so we need to have a headline of some sort. So for a headline, we're going to take the type tool, and for initially, what I will do is just left click and drag out a text area, and then I will center it right here. And then we're going to have our primary headline. Now, you as a UI designer, that's not your job to think about what it should say. That's the job of a marketer / a person who deals with ad copy. So again, it's nice to have these skills. So understanding ad copy is extremely important if you're kind of like the Swiss Army freelancer. So that's something you would want to research. I'm just going to type in web hosting for the modern era. All right, and so then I'm going to increase this quite large. All right, so there's a few things happening here in terms of UI design fundamentals that we have to make sure we've nailed down. First, is it large enough? So that's kind of a weird question because we have to consider what exactly this type is and what its purpose is. Well, it's a headline, and it's to address what exactly this site is about, or not what exactly this site is about, but to give them a good idea. And this is probably one of the most important elements, if not the most important element on this page right here. So we want to make sure it's large and it sticks out quite well, and it has a lot of white space around it. Otherwise, you push it like this, and that's not enough. It's also inconsistent. We have this amount of white space right here from the top, but then we have nothing right here. So you're going to want to make sure it's spaced out. And XD obviously has this stuff already worked in pretty well when it comes to the guides. So also the contrast, it's sticking out quite well. We could make it this blue color, but then the contrast isn't quite as high, and it's harder to read actually. Plus, we already have a ton of blue right in this section. So in terms of visual hierarchy, this sort of gets lost. So we're just going to make this black. All right, and then we're going to duplicate it. We'll have a subheadline, which is also very common on most websites. And we'll bring down the size. And again, this goes back to visual hierarchy. The most important element is this headline. Therefore, we're going to reinforce the importance of it by separating these two visually in different properties in different ways. So we've already scaled it down. Let's get I'm just going to say go serverless, the actual ad copy, go serverless and pay only for what you use. Okay. All right. Now let's say, for instance, we can see if we click on this, this is 51, the size, and this is 37. It's quite different, right? But is it enough? I mean, these are almost too similar. So you have to make sure in some other manner, if not through scale, through another property, that you reinforce, the hierarchy between these two. And basically let this element, this type element right here, this piece of ad copy, know that it is secondary, it is inferior to this very important element right here. So if we're going to leave it at this size, we have to do something else. We could take down the opacity, but still, it's not good enough just because the scale between these two elements is too similar. So we want to make sure it goes down probably right around there and probably no larger. And maybe you could get away with going a little bit smaller. And then you can also, so we can see now that it's a lot better because your eye is automatically drawn here. Also, if we use and make this maybe semi-bold, that works out a lot better. And then we can also take down and make this maybe kind of like a darker gray. You don't want to go too gray like this because then it won't be readable for some people who have bad eyesight. So maybe right around here. And then it could be debatable. Now we may not have to make this bold. We could just go to regular. And something like that. Maybe we'll go back to medium. I think I like medium actually. And one thing you have to do, you definitely have to consider is how many different weights you're going to be integrating. This is where an understanding of front-end development will help because the more font weights you integrate into a layout, that's more load time because those have to be downloaded. So if we're going to use like a medium, we want to probably only use a medium and then just the regular or semi-bold. Semi-bold might be better to go with this. That way we have two contrasting weights that contrast with each other quite well. All right, so now looking at this, the next question is, all right, obviously if this is a landing page of some sort, this isn't enough. We have to have more information to scroll down. And if we're not going to have any type of call to action like a button or some area where they fill out an email, which wouldn't make sense really for this context right here, the purpose of the site, then we need to let people know and have a clear path of what should they do. This could be in the form of a button, like for instance, it could be a button that says learn more or our services, etc. But if there's more content that you want them to access, you can have what is now pretty commonly associated, a good pattern to let people know to scroll. And you can usually use CSS animation to make this even more evident in the icon. So we're going to have a scroll icon, kind of like the mouse wheel, and that's very easy to make. So I'll just zoom up here, and we'll take the rectangle tool, just holding Alt, putting size somewhere around there. We're going to make it completely rounded on the edges. No fill on this, and we'll make it our blue color. And we will increase the size of the weight, or the stroke rather. So looking at this, the size of a stroke is also very important. First of all, I'm looking at all the other elements here and trying to make sure that I have a good weight. For instance, if I made this just 1, you could barely see that, right? If I made it like that, that's way too much too. So we're just going to stick to around 5. And then also to make this more obvious that it's a scroll wheel, we'll duplicate this, hold Shift and Alt. We'll get rid of the stroke and this time make it a fill of the same color. And we want to make sure there's enough space here between these elements. Or we can push it down. That would make more sense because we want them to scroll down. Something like that. All right, so you can adjust this as needed. Maybe you think it should be wider. And then center this. Or make any of those adjustments that you think, but I think this is pretty good right here. Like that. And then just make sure it's all centered up with your alignment tools. So I think this is pretty good. And what we would do, what I would recommend is if this is, once this is implemented from the front-end developer yourself, if you're taking on that role, is to make this kind of hover up and down a little bit. Very subtle. You don't want it to take too much attention away. Just to let people know that it needs to scroll. All right, so now looking at everything that we have before we continue, again, make sure that first, if we're looking at the top, make sure that everything that we have here we can see. All right, so color and contrast, very important. This is clearly not a problem with any of this because we're dealing with type that's black on a white background, so we know we're good in that department. Is the white space and the margin and the padding, is that good? You know, is it consistent? So that's real important. It looks pretty consistent to me. How about this element? Are the colors working with the rest of the site colors? And yeah, looks pretty decent to me. I may make some tweaks to it in the future, but it's fine to me for now. How about its location in terms of white space between the other elements? Is it absolutely centered as it should be? Yes. How about the headline text? Can we read it? Is it of a good size? Does it separate itself from the other elements on the page? How about this in relation to that? There's a lot of concerns, clearly. If we think about these two elements as their own block, and I'll group these up, we can see we have this amount of white space, which is pretty consistent from the top of this to that. And how about this element? We'll group that up too, compared to the rest. And that's pretty darn close as being, you know, something that a design here, at least just initially looking at this, that has all of the UI design fundamentals pretty much nailed at this point. And of course, this is a more simple approach, but I want to keep things simple, especially for beginners. So let's go ahead and select the canvas, and we're going to create a secondary portion on this UI design. So when they scroll down, they're going to encounter this area over here. Now, first, you may be wondering, what is that dashed line? And that dashed line is basically the viewport height. So I don't want to see that dashed line because it kind of throws me off. So I'm just going to make it the same height as the canvas itself. And it's there just to let you know like where the viewable area is, or traditionally has been called whether or not it's below the fold for the user before scrolling down. So now let's go ahead and we'll do in a section right here of content. Now, right now at the top, we have a lot of white occurring here. All right, it would be a good idea to break that up somehow, either through maybe like a photograph like background that's watermarked, or through just a solid color. Now, traditionally, we could just we could do something like this. We'll take the rectangle tool. Don't do this yet. Just watch me. Maybe we'll take this blue color. There we go. Notice where I put it. we have a lot of white space between these elements, which is very important, especially on a bigger viewport resolution like this. And this would work perfectly fine. What we're seeing now as a trend from 2018-ish to now into 2019 is to use to break outside of the standard box or the rectangle and structure these different sections of content maybe more uniquely. So some people have been doing stuff like this. Maybe just placing a slight angle. That's a different way to approach it. And we can even take that a step further. So this is what I'm going to try to do. We're going to take the pen tool and we're going to create just a very slight, so hold shift so that you're at a 45-degree angle, maybe right around here, and then let go, and then just create a very slight angle just like that. And we'll make it go all the way to this side. Left click and drag to create a Bezier curve, and then down right there. And you can obviously adjust these with your keyboard if you screwed something up. And then we'll come down here, hold shift, and then we'll just make this one a typical line at the bottom and then connect it up. So then we could fill this in with a blue. All right, and just notice how different and more stylish that this looks. And this is a certain aesthetic that then can be used over and over again throughout the design, which is really important for the UI design fundamental of consistency. So I think that's pretty solid right there. We have a decent amount of white space. If this angle is too dramatic, because you don't want it to be too dramatic, it'll throw it off, you can always make adjustments. So if we want this to be higher, put it like right around there. And that's maybe a little bit better. It's less dramatic of an angle. All right. So now we have two really contrasting sections of content here to deal with. And now we can put in supporting information based on this landing page. And if you're a UI designer, you're doing this for a client or a company, then you will be provided this information. Usually in the context of maybe like a wireframe or just a general document outlining what they want on the page. So for us, let's bring back the grid and let's put in 3 columns of information, maybe with an icon at the top and maybe some text beneath it, supporting text that's relevant based on the different type of the qualities or the features associated with this service that makes it a good service, right? So we will bring this the grid back, but for now, let's just get rid of it. Actually, no, let's keep it, and I'm just going to use the type tool. And we're going to zoom up here. And if we're going to have 3, then we're going to situate these so that they're within 4 grid containers. And I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to do something and then make an adjustment just to show you, demonstrate a point. I'm going to left click right here at the very beginning of that grid and to the very end of the 4th one. All right. And I'm just going to type in test for now. And I'm also going to make this white so it contrasts better than that black did. And I'm also going to go use a plugin in Adobe XD. And if you just go to Discover Plugins and you search for a plugin called Lorem Ipsum Text, you'll find it. I'm just going to select this right here. You could do quick Lorem Ipsum, and there we go. That's just filler text that you use. It's Latin if you don't really have content right off initially to put in there. So I will say somewhere, actually I wanted a little bit more Lorem Ipsum text, so I'm going to go back. Just put fill with placeholder, insert, there we go. So now we have more, and we could just cut off based on the amount that we want or not. Now, if we had 3 columns of this, so I duplicate this. Don't if you're following along, don't do this part. I just want to make a point. And you make it, and you make this text that 4 columns, and there's only 12 of them. And they're just going to be so close together that you're going to lack white space between them. This is way too cluttered. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're doing this. When you're working with the grid, you want to put spacing in between there. So let me demonstrate this in a different way. It might be a little bit more dynamic and time saving. If we bring the grid back and we take this in, maybe right around in there, and then we do repeat grid and drag this out to the right just to 3. And then we extend this so that these are roughly around the same area. If we change one of these, for instance, we'll change this one. If we change this one, the rest will change as well. So that's just one tip that's handy about the repeat grid tool. I'm going to ungroup it though and just get rid of these initially. And we're just going to focus on what this first one will look like. So let's get rid of the columns here, or the grid. There we go. And we have to ask ourselves, you know, first we have to get the scale of this type correct. We also have to determine whether or not we're going to make it the thicker font weight, the bold. We have to make sure we have a good amount of white space again, and also spacing. I mentioned before we're going to have some sort of icon, but instead of sitting here trying to design icons from scratch, we're going to use a resource. So I'm going to get up my browser window right here, if it'll load. And just off screen, I'll type in iconfinder.com. And this is just one of many resources that you can use to find icons for your project. So if I type in calendar, for instance, and I sort by license type, no link back, just so I can use it here. And I look through, and also we want to choose free. Now these are all icons that we could potentially use. And so the type of icon that you use, by the way, it really should match the general aesthetic of your website, especially if you've already have established a certain style. And some of them obviously are a little bit more silly than the others, and you wouldn't use some for certain projects. For me, I just want something that's real clean and simple, maybe like this right here. And usually when you click these, they will be associated maybe as a part of an icon set, and you can use other ones in your project. There are many, many other resources that you can use, by the way, for finding icons, but this is just one of them. And you could download, SVGs as well, which is what we're going to do for this. So click download SVG, and you open this up in the Explorer. So if I show in folder, and I drag that on. By the way, when you drag it, you want to make sure you don't drag it on top of an element because it'll replace it sometimes. Now we're going to drag this on here, if I can get it. It's transparent, so I can't really. There we go. Oh boy. Scale this down. We're going to make it white as well because we really want it to contrast as much as possible. All right, so again, use your guides. You can see that it centered it within this element beneath it. The first thing I'm looking at here is there's two things I'm looking at. It's scale and as well as spacing. In contrast, we already nailed that down. So the white space around it, I mean, it should really, everything should really flow together. I'm looking at the white space between these elements and between this element here, between this element here, and then between the top of this element and right here as well. Now, of course, because we do have this container that's sort of changes in height right here, it's not going to be perfect. They're not all going to align with each other in terms of equal spacing when we have the other three, but that's okay as long as it's subtle. I think right here, around here is pretty good for the amount of white space from this part to here. You definitely wouldn't want to do something like this. That throws everything off to me when I look at this. It's just too close. So we'll put it back down right around there. And then we'll also change this to regular. As long as our font size is a little bit larger like this, we should be fine. The size is 28. The size of this is also 28 right there. We could probably go down a little bit more in terms of the size. Maybe right around there is good. And then also I'm looking at the bottom of this. comparing it to the top of up here. So if I take real quickly, don't do this. You can do this if you want, but it's not a part of the design. If we make this like something that's really ugly in contrast, this is the amount of white space from here to here. This is the amount of white space from the bottom of this element to here, and obviously there's too much. So if we double click this, take these two anchor points and drag them up, suddenly it's going to look a lot better. Now, looking at this from this angle, it's looking okay, but really sometimes it's hard to judge until you actually get in there and add the 3 replicas of this. So let's bring back our grid. So this is 4 grid columns long, or wide rather, and with a decent amount of padding within it. So let's take this and this, we'll duplicate it, we'll put it roughly right here. This can be pretty much in the center of the entire document, and then over here we'll match the right. There we go, perfect. So now if we get rid of the grid, this is what we have going so far. So I think looking at this, now that I have it zoomed way out, looking at the amount of white space between this element and this element compared to the amount of white space between this element and that element, we can probably definitely move these up more. So I'll just take all this and just deselect the background right there and move this up probably right around here, just to account for the fact that this is on a slant right here. So I think that's much better. We can drag this up a little bit more as well. And there we go. Now I'm going to just change up the text here just to make it look a little bit different. Like that. Also another, you know what I may do? It looks like there's just too much text right here. So one thing we can do is adjust the line height. So we could change it from 28 maybe to 38. And now it's a lot easier to read. So that's another thing that you could pay attention to. I'm just translating this real quick. There we go. There we go. Pretty much a lot better right there. All right, great. So now we're going to have a second area, or a third area, or a third section really. We have our first hero section up here. We have this section right here with the icons. By the way, I probably will pause this and just take 2 more icons from that same set and put these in. So I'll do that real quick. All right, and there we go. I just took a wallet here and a phone, whatever. You want to make sure that they're the same size and the same thickness though. Otherwise it'll look inconsistent, which again, in terms of UI design, I'll just throw everything on. For instance, if I made this smaller, all of a sudden things just don't look right. And that's because they're not consistent in terms of the thickness. Okay, so far we're looking really solid. Let's do that third section down here. You don't necessarily have to keep on doing this. I think we'll do it maybe for the footer, for that there's a certain aesthetic that we have applied here. For this one, let's just maybe do a smaller section just for like testimonials. And so we'll have whatever you want to do, you want to make sure that your sections will contrast with each other well enough. So when it comes to different types of content, that's just one way you can prioritize visually over different sections. And so to do that, you could either go lighter or darker, right? So if we take the same color, which you wouldn't want to do if you're separating the different types of content. So this is just features, and then we're going to have testimonials. We're going to style them differently. What we could do is we could go darker. You could also experiment with the saturation as well. I mean, you could even go darker, or with pretty much nothing, no color. You could go black if you wanted to. One thing you wouldn't want to do is come up around here. That looks horrible. There's not enough contrast, and it kind of hurts your eyes when you look at it. See that? Ugh, It's terrible, but I see people do that all the time. So you want to stay away from the mid ranges when you're dealing with colors. So you want it to either go up here, where you can still see that there is certainly a container here, but it contrasts enough with this element as well. Or as well as up here. I mean, this was desaturated. This is bringing in that blue a little bit. This works as well. Or coming down darker. And you can get pretty close while still having, you know, with still creating enough contrast. For me, though, I think we're just going to go kind of with like a very light gray right around here. Again, you could go darker, whatever. Again, some of this is subjective. All right, so we'll keep that right around there. I'm going to drag this down just a little bit further because we're going to have maybe a little bit more area down here. And now in this section, we can go ahead and put maybe 2 testimonials. So we will bring back our grid. Let's save this, by the way. I haven't done that yet. UI toot. All right, it looks like it's saving in the cloud. This is an updated version I haven't used yet. So now we can ask ourselves, do we want to have 3 more columns of testimonials, which that could be a little bit repetitive looking. So I think we'll just have 2 columns. All right, so as long as it fits within with a good amount of padding inside of the element, the content and the grids, it'll work well within 6 rows. So I'll take, let's see, I'm gonna have like an avatar associated with like a person in them. I'll put one right here, and we may end up moving things around. And one thing that I like to use, we'll get rid of the stroke, is there's a plugin called Photo Splash that you can use. I think there's a few others, but Photo Splash should work. Actually, there's one that's more specific to this. It's called UI Faces. There we go. Now you can just generate avatars in your design mockups. You have to select an element, and then you choose if you want male and happy. Let's choose chicks for this. Apply faces. There we go. I love it. All right, so this is one of the reasons it's so much better than Photoshop, which is what us old schoolers used to use. So we'll put this right around here for now, and then we'll have a text area. And right now I'm not worried about the size too much. I'm going to left align this, and I'm just going to put in probably just some more lorem ipsum text. So I'm not concerned about the color right now. I'm just going to get this in here. Lorem ipsum. I will do. Okay. For now, let's get rid of this. It's throwing off my ability to see it clearly. So what we'll do is make this here black. All right, so it contrasts real well, maximum, in fact, given this background. So because this is a quote, we can just put quotes like that. And if you want, yeah, we can also make it italicized like that. All right, and then we can also put a person's their name or something, or wherever they're from. I'm just going to put Jane Doe. All right, so now we have 3 elements here, and we have 2 type elements, but they're not separated from each other visually, right? We're going back to visual hierarchy here. So for this element, we have to ask ourselves, which is most important? Is it the person's name, or is it what they're saying? That could be debatable. But for me, we want to separate these 2 at least, to just so that people don't confuse and get confused by them. We want them to immediately know they're 2 separate elements. So we do that. We could do it through color. Maybe make it bold. And I'm not too much of a fan of this this blue on this gray. It feels like it doesn't quite contrast enough. So we could take this background and just lighten it up just a tad. And I think that works now. We could also change the scale as well. So now we've really separated these elements out quite a bit from each other. We could also probably afford to make this a little bit wider, because again, once we're going to get the grid back out and make sure it fits within the area, the 6 grid columns. So now what I'm looking at when I position this is the amount of white space between this section in the bottom of this text and then this section in the top of this text. So that's where we get consistency as much as possible. And then at the bottom, bring that up just like that. Okay. So now let's bring back the grid. All right, so grid. All right, so our columns are right here. The end of the 6th column is right here. So we're going to take these 3, make sure that they're pretty much even with each other. This is starting right here on the left of this line. So again, the alignment is important here. I think that looks pretty good. So we're going to take this, duplicate it, and then just put it basically where it would be on the 2nd column. All right, so now let's get rid of this view here. All right, and that looks pretty good. We could take this and just go to uifaces.com, or uifaces.com. It's uifaces plugin. Apply it. Seriously? Hold on, let's try that again. uifaces. This time we'll do a mail. There we go. All right, cool. So that seems to work pretty well right here. All right, good. Everything's looking solid and very consistent visually. So next, maybe we'll have a strong call to action to maybe buy the service or try it out. Let's figure out how we'll do that. And again, there's many different ways, but as long as we nail those fundamentals down, we'll be good to go. So what I'll do is we'll take, let's see, we'll just take a type right here, the type tool just randomly right there. I'm going to say start your free trial now. All right, so we're going to make this black. We'll make it regular. And we're going to make it large because this is important, right? So we're going to reinforce the importance of this just through the size. Now, notice how I have it off to the side. We could put it exactly in the center and then have a button right here, or we could put it to the left with a button right here. Up to you. And ultimately, if you have somebody, hopefully whoever site this is, they have somebody on the team to split test this stuff, which is a process of doing A/B split test to determine the placement of elements on your UI, like which ones result in the most clicks. And there's ways to test that with JavaScript and all that cool stuff. So anyhow, we'll just assume we're going to give this a starting point right here. So we're going to create a button. And we want it to be pretty big. And most important, when it comes to these calls to action, you want them to really stick out because they're a direction, they're an action that you want the user to take, and so you want them to see it. So making it blue may not be the best idea because there are already a lot of blue elements on a page. So if we have a secondary color, like an accent color, that might be a great color to use. So if you want to, again, when it comes to this type of when it comes to consistency, do you want to have completely rounded corners for your buttons, or do you want them completely square? There's no right or wrong. It only becomes right or wrong if you're mixing styles up in the same UI. And so really, I think we're just going to go and make the determination that we're going to use rounded corners because some elements are rounded, like this is rounded. This little icon is rounded. Our icons right here have rounded corners. So that would definitely be the best bet to take. So now let's put in some type right here. So I'm going to left click and drag from the very left to the right of the button and then center it. And then we're going to type in get started, some sort of effective call to action button text. That may not be it, but I'm not an app copy guy and I haven't thought about this one too much. This project at least, which is fake. So then I'll put in, we'll make this bold because we really want the type to stick out. In the size, again, there is such thing as too big. That looks horrible. Such thing as too small. That looks horrible. So you want to find a nice medium right there somewhere, maybe right around there. You want to make sure, use your keyboard arrow keys, that it's all even inside of this button. If the button's too wide, for instance, you could take it and hold Alt, maybe bring it in a notch. All right. And then we can bring these things maybe a little bit closer. Maybe right around there. So if we're looking at spacing between these elements, you don't always have to go like, for instance, between this element here, let me draw it out just so we can get a visual of what the amount of white space looks like. So we have that element here. If we duplicate it, we have this, which is almost the same. We should probably bring these down because they're not, and I want them to be the same. There we go. And then we have this going from, really, when it comes to the bulk of the content, it's kind of in the center. So this sort of offsets it. So I think it should go from here to right around there, which is pretty even. All right. And then from here to here, that's pretty much exactly even right there. All right. So you don't necessarily have to make them all even, especially if you're dealing with a different area that's important. You could bring it down maybe by about 30% more. And that's a judgment that you can make. We're almost done. We're going to put in a footer. So let's go ahead and change this viewport height here. I don't want that dotted line there. 3113. Let's save things. All right, and let's put it in our footer. So what we'll do is I'm going to take this, duplicate it, Control D, and we could keep it like the same flow, or we could do something really different and just flip them, holding Alt. All right, and then this is too much blue now. We have this big area with blue. It has a very specific purpose, and then we have kind of more of an afterthought, which is the footer. So let's change that up in some way. You could go real light, or you can go maybe darker. Maybe we could work in something like this up here. But because it's not so important, I might want to desaturate the color so it doesn't stick out quite as much. And maybe we'll go something like that. Let me take this up a little bit, right around there. And then take the canvas height and match it right around there. All right. One thing I'm not kind of liking is this is quite a steep angle that I put there, but yeah, that's okay for now. Now there's an uneven amount of white space here, so I'm just going to take this. There we go. That's more centered vertically in there. And then we could just do something simple, like we could take the logo, we'll duplicate that. We'll right click and arrange and bring it to front. And then we'll get this aligned up to the very first start of the column right there, so it's in line with the top logo. We'll make this white. There we go. And then we'll put in something like, we can, well, maybe put like the address of the place or something. And again, when it comes to secondary type content like this, it doesn't have to really stick out. Melrose Place, 90210. I don't even know what I'm doing. Who remembers that show? Oh man. We'll make this go regular. And because it's not entirely important, we can bring down the opacity, and that way it creates separation between itself and the logo. We'll put a second thing here, USA, whatever. There we go. All right, good. Now look how much white space I've utilized right here. Let's see how it looks like. It looks in the bigger context of everything. We could probably make that a little bit bigger. And then we could ask ourselves if we want to have another common pattern is to have vertical sub-navigations right here. If you want to do that, I'm not going to do that. I think I might just take this and duplicate it, put it over here, right align it. We could do something like terms of service. Yeah, I didn't really have to right align that. Let me duplicate that. And privacy policy or something. Something like this. And these you would want to make sure is right aligned up to that the grid. So if we get the grid back out, and then align it. Now we know it's aligned horizontally where it needs to be. It needs to be aligned up in a place that makes sense and consistent with the text to the left as well. All right, so now let's uncheck that. And I would say this is pretty solid. Normally, I mean, there would be more content here to fill this out a little bit more, but for now, I think we've got a pretty good grip on this UI design here. So let's go ahead and save that. And what you would really start to do now is you would, if this were a full real project, you would duplicate this artboard by selecting it, Control D, and then you would start designing what the services page might look like, for instance. And again, you would just want to make sure that everything you're doing is consistent visually with those basic UI design fundamentals that we discussed both throughout this project and at the beginning of this video. So I think this would be a pretty good area to end this bit of UI design crash course, and hopefully you were able to learn a lot. It shows a pretty basic layout that I think would be quite effective, especially even in this day and age. I think the things that we're seeing now for some of the modern UI design trends, they're going in ways that are a little bit more complex than this. But I think if you're starting out, try to do something like this, and it would still look nice and modern. And what I will be doing is creating a second crash course using this mockup for front-end development. So we're going to take this design that we created here in Adobe XD and then make it a reality in the browser through HTML, CSS, and perhaps even work in some JavaScript as well. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that. If you liked it, share it around with other aspiring UI designers, and make sure you subscribe here if you haven't yet. Click the notification bell icon, and I'll see you guys soon. Goodbye.